In my last few audios, I've been emphasizing the fundamental ethical violation that's going on with the medical mandates, how it's an act of abuse, it's a form of slavery. Worth also talking about is, of course, the very real increase in suffering that this has caused, particularly to children, which is the most disturbing part about it. So, a lot of folks actually have been talking about how putting the masks on children in school and isolating them from one another, putting them in these like squares or circles, in the classroom and or even in these like plexiglass cubes in the classroom um, is actually abusive, right? And you have to try and, first of all, whether you think it has medical merit or not, any rational person should recognize that this is probably going to be traumatic to the child, right? It's not normal for a child to be living that way, to be interacting with others that way, to be, masked up and isolated and treated as though they are a danger to society, right? That their very breath, is a threat to humanity, and so they need to be uh, controlled like a prisoner in a prison, right? Like some maximum security type thing. That is traumatic, right? Without a doubt, that is traumatic to many, if not all of these children. And that's an awful thing, right? Childhood trauma is a terrible thing, which has extremely, negative consequences, not only for that individual for the rest of their life, how long it, for however long it takes them to overcome that trauma, if they ever do. And that's just the psychological trauma. And then you factor in also the physical injury being um, executed uh, by the masks themselves, right? Reduction of airflow, right? This has also caused great anxiety for children too. They can't breathe properly, right? So they more likely to have like a panic attack and just not be able to relax, right? Hypertension, a child who's forced to put the covering over their mouth and nose for the majority of their day. And then on top of that, we have the injuries caused by the actual injections themselves, right? Which mainstream media acts as if isn't happening at all. Like, injury by pharmaceutical is a non-occurrence, right? It's just sick deception, right? To act as though no child has ever been injured by pharmaceutical injections. Of course they have been. And of course they are being injured. And some of it is night and day, right? They're perfectly healthy. I mean, there's countless cases like that of vaccine injury where the child or infant is perfectly healthy. They take the vaccine or the third or fourth, fifth dose or whatever. And then, 40, in less than 48 hours, they're showing severe negative health effects, right? So, mainstream medicine and the state is, which, of course, is working hand in hand with Big Pharma and doesn't want to accept any liability, act as though, oh, these are all just coincidences or whatever. Or the few that they do acknowledge, get kind of brushed under the rug and never given the attention that they deserve. So the point I wanted to emphasize here is that this is just really sickening child abuse happening on a mass scale. And so whether the people up top are doing this just for a profit motive, right? Just basic economics, right? You have a product that's been made mandatory, so of course these pharmaceutical companies are making tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars in, the past year and a half alone. And then the politicians, of course, getting their share of that, it being this revolving door between the industry and the politicians. That's definitely a factor. But the fact that, when you look at someone like Joe and you look at the way he acts around children, and you look at his just bizarre insistence on now injecting younger and younger children with these concoctions with no regard for the very real reality of injury. It seems to me like to call them possibly satanic is not that crazy of an idea. Like it is possible. Like are there any Satanists in the world? Yeah, probably. I think it's safe to say yes. And what would a Satanist want to do? Like they're totally demented. Like their number one priority would be like, how can I abuse the most children in the world? Well, is it just coincidence that this whole fake pandemic and medical tyranny just so happens to be uh, an act of mass child abuse, and it just so happens that it's being done by these shady people with the most power and wealth who have been known, that segment of the population have been known to be like a place where Satanists have operated, right? Like it's not. I admit this is you could say, conspiracy theory, but it's not really that out there. There are Satanists with immense power and wealth. What would they want to do if they had that immense power and wealth? Well, pretty much what's going on right now, right? So it's just um, it's just really disturbing to see parents like just give their children away to these people, right? And they may just be looking at their local school level, but of course there's a chain of command, right? The principal of that school is following basically, right, the orders of the governor, and the governor's following the orders coming from the White House, right? It's all basically just a chain of obedience from top to bottom. So if there are some satanic, insane people at the top, their orders are going to work their way down all the way to your, classroom teacher, to your elementary school teacher, who are then telling the kids that they have to put these coverings on their face and isolate themselves, stand in these squares or circles, or go in these plexiglass cubes and get tested, and repeatedly. And this is all traumatic, and it's all really sick. And for parents to just go along with this because it's in the name of safety is really bizarre. Like there have been some parents that have been very vocal about rejecting this, but not enough. A lot are just going along with it, and they think, well, there's just this pandemic, and we're just taking necessary precautions. Like again, the fact that they're completely trusting these so-called experts and authorities to give the perfect treatment and prescribe the perfect device. And how can you just ignore all of the injuries occurring? It's like Stockholm syndrome, where you take the side of your abuser, and no matter how much harm they do, you're blind to it. It's idolatry, right? It's literally idol worship, turning a blind eye to abuse. I mean, the suicide rate has gone up very significantly, right? I don't know if I believe it's been breaking records, right? People are going through immense psychological trauma, with children and adults, from all of these lockdowns. And People think it's just some kind of like tough love, like, well, this is what we got to do to slow the spread. Like, that's, again, if you're thinking that way, what you're not thinking about is the fact that you're completely trusting these politicians in the pharmaceutical industry to give the perfect solution. Like, you're handing over your life and the lives of your children to these people. Complete trust, right? As if they're divine. You wouldn't trust your neighbor or a stranger on the street to do these things. You would call it abusive if a so-called regular person does it. But yet you think it's not abusive when they do it just because the mass media presents them as these, prestigious experts, and you just believe whatever they say about how much they care, and it's just naive idolatry that accepts abuse, and it's resulting in a massive amount of suffering. If you think the issue is complicated, it's not. Medical mandates are a form of slavery. Slavery is evil and should always be rejected outright. Slavery is never a correct response to any crisis. Doesn't matter if it's a health crisis, if it's a natural disaster, a war. Slavery is never a legitimate response to anything at any time, anywhere. If you could just get that, if you could just stand in that truth, then you wouldn't let them have their way with you and your children and make the world worse and worse, actually, and make it more and more of a totalitarian police state. It's really not complicated. But if you keep believing everything you see in the mass media, if you keep just letting yourself be intimidated and let yourself be distracted by red herrings where they're just going on about the numbers of reported cases, it's all irrelevant to the fundamental ethics that the mandates are abusive. The mandates are a form of slavery. Responding to an illness is one, as far as what's the best medical choices to make or nutrition choices to make. That's one issue to be discussed and decided on by sovereign individuals who make their own choices, right? And it being mandated by politicians and and their pharmaceutical partners. That's the other issue. Like, you should be able to discern the two and not keep thinking that the two must come together. Like, you should be able to separate the two, I should say, and say, yeah, we can talk about the numbers and we can talk about vitamin C and all the rest of that, and even vaccines or whatever treatments, that's one discussion. But before you can talk about that, you should get straight that the mandates are not acceptable because they're a form of slavery that just hands over your bodily autonomy and the bodily autonomy of your children to these so-called authorities and experts who possibly could be Satanists, actually, or at the very least, just profit-hungry, unethical people, regardless of who they are. They're not worthy of being slave masters. If you want to follow their guidance, go ahead. But the idea to accept that it can be a mandate for the entire population is ridiculous. And it's just sick to see the abuse going on and the trauma occurring with all of these children. It's really horrible, actually.